Good afternoon and welcome to EWN's live national budget broadcast of 2023. I'm Refilwe Moloto, coming to you live from City Hall, the temporary home of the joint national houses of parliament, where in about 30 minutes time, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana will deliver the budget speech for the year, which will govern the country's spending over the medium-term expenditure framework. Now, the backdrop of today's budget could not be more telling of the context of South Africa's current economic quagmire. We sit in stage 6 load shedding nationally, stage 5 in Cape Town, and are on the precipice, many experts say, of stage 8 load shedding in the country due to continued maintenance breakdowns at Eskom's many power stations. Meters from our studio, COSATU and affiliate unions are currently protesting against what they anticipate to be an anti-poor budget and also seeking better wage relief and more financial relief for the working class and the poor of the country. And this is against the backdrop of anemic GDP growth, which also, in addition to inflation, was attempted to be tempered by the South African Reserve Bank just last month with another 25 basis point hike to a 7.25% repo rate. All of this is happening while in Paris, the Financial Action Task Force is just deliberating in this week in meetings whether or not South Africa will be grey-listed by the end of this week. It's safe to say today's budget is possibly one of the most significant that our Finance Minister and National Treasury will need to face. And of course, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana faces the unenviable job of having to balance these very many critical priorities. I'm joined this afternoon to navigate what those might be today with economist as well as futurist Professor Andre Roux of Stellenbosch Business School, who joins me to help us understand what we might anticipate from the medium-term expenditure framework. And EWN's own Editor-in-Chief, Sbu Ngalwa, is joining us today to also understand the political context in which we sit at the moment. Professor Sbu, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks very much for being with us. The unfortunate hat, which no doubt he'll be wearing today, that none of us thankfully has to wear, that the Finance Minister has, of course, balances a few things. At the medium-term budget statement of 2022, National Treasury defined 5 key macro outlook risks to the budget that we needed to anticipate. Those included a slowdown in global economic growth that would stymie our revenue collection, continuous electricity supply constraints, higher than budgeted public service wage costs, contingent liabilities materializing, in particular from SOEs, and potentially new unfunded spending pressures. It would seem all 5 of those risks have begun to materialize. No doubt we should fairly assess which of those priorities may come up first. Professor, I'll begin with you. I anticipate Eskom should be at the top of the list today.
I think you're right. I think Eskom will be front and center. We got the cue, amongst other things, from the President's speech a few weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago. And I think there can be no doubt that Eskom is bothering everybody from all walks of life. If we bear in mind that some estimates reckon that power cuts are shaving off up to 2% of our already, as you said, extremely anemic growth rate, that it deserves to be one of the most important central issues this afternoon.
And what kind of bandwidth do we have in order to quell the downward spiral of Eskom? Naturally, today's conversation will not be operational, it'll be financial.
Exactly.
What are some of the needs that Treasury may be expected to take on?
I think, again, we can take the cue from last year's medium-term budget speech, where the ministers indicated some kind of debt relief. The amount we don't know, some are speculating at least 50%. By alleviating that debt, it should free up resources for Eskom to do what they should be doing. Of course, it creates a whole new can of worms, but when needs must, needs must.
Indeed. Sbu, what are your thoughts here in terms of the landscape that the ANC government has to play with that kind of decision?
Well, the reality is that, Refilwe, as you say, this is an important speech that also actually precedes a national election next year. So those are also considerations that the ANC will have to make. And I have no doubt, as the professor, in fact, as everyone has said, that Eskom will top that. And I do believe that perhaps we can expect that there might be some concessions that are announced by the minister, and some decisions which might be border on the populist side, because remember, this is also an ANC in government, and if you go back to 2019, just on the eve of that election, they were actually rolling blackouts, and the ANC believes that part of their poor showing in that election had to do with what happened with those blackouts by ESCOM. And the big thing, obviously, Soweto being one of them. So I know it's parochial, but do trust me, there probably will be something coming out there, because if you listen to the Premier of Gauteng, he has been dropping hints. He dropped hints about toll gates. He now has been dropping hints about ESCOM and particularly about Soweto. So I think as we go into this budget speech, the ANC sent a very short and a curt statement, which was actually one paragraph, that they expect a pro-poor budget, but they made an important line about a solution to the electricity problem. So this is a budget speech that comes under the cloud of stage 6.
So,
and latching onto that theme of an election in a year's time, it will probably also have a bearing on a decision regarding social grants.
Yes.
Will it be continued, extended, and if so, what's the magnitude, what's the amount going to be? I think links up to your point about, there's an election in a year's time and you don't want to alienate your potential supporters.
Cost of living is at the forefront of every person's mind in South Africa, be they middle income or low income at this particular time. So just to pick up on two of those themes, from the ESCOM side of things, the President hinted at SONA that the NERSA 18% increase, the NERSA requested 18% increase in tariffs should possibly be staved off. Yeah. The 68 billion rand or so that was set aside to extend the social relief of distress grant up until March 2024, if you look at the medium-term budget policy statement of last October, was expected to roll off by then. But as you say, the President hinted in SONA that it shall possibly be something that's here to stay. Let's talk a little bit about how we fund this. Because we have a limited, I suppose, range of sources of finance. Perhaps let's start on the taxation side and then we'll come to the funding position. Yeah. Corporate and personal income tax tend to be very large pockets, but it seems as though South Africa trends towards a 25% corporate tax. That's an unlikely source of funding, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, we go back a step. The actual tax base is under extreme pressure because of low and slow growth, as it is all over the world. So organic growth in the tax base is going to be virtually non-existent. So that begs the question then, well, what is the unorganic growth? Which rates do we increase? Corporate tax rates, as you rightly said, there's kind of a commitment to bring that down to 25%. I think the best they can do this year, today, would be to postpone the further decline, but probably not to raise it. Personal income tax, well, be overtaxed as it is, as we all know.
Correct.
And with the consumer class, which is hard hit, as you pointed out, in any case, you'd really be killing the goose that lays the proverbial egg, bearing in mind that consumer spending makes up about 60% of this economy. Yes. So then you've got VAT, and VAT is obviously always has been, probably always will be politically contentious. Yes. It makes sense from a pure economic point of view to raise the VAT rate, but not from
probably
a political.
Not this time around.
Exactly. So what's left? Well, your so-called sin taxes.
Yes.
That'll go up, yes.
As they always do.
As they always do. And we'll titter politely and say, oh, well, that's too bad, and we'll just carry on as usual. But it really won't make a huge dent, I'm afraid, into the needs.
Two more sort of columns of tax revenue source. Let's talk about fuel levies, for example, and contributions to the RAF. Probably the only area where it's ring-fenced, but the rest of the fuel levy could go into the fiscus. Is it also a politically contentious time to hope to increase those by any significant measures?
Look, if you recall from last year's speech, Refilwe, the fact that there was no increase for the first time since 1990 in the fuel levy and the REF levy, the finance minister, and having spoken to people close to him, it seems like it's something he might want to do this time around, because the argument is that we already have households under pressure. I mean, if you look at someone who bought a house worth R1 million a mere 2 years ago, who's now paying an additional 3,000 rand on their bond, and you look at increase in wages, the wages and salaries are not increasing at the rate at which inflation is growing. And also that call by the president that you mentioned, where he says that the 18% tariff hike by NERSA is excessive. Well, ESCOM is arguing that even that 18% is not enough for the cost of generating electricity. So whichever way it goes, there has to be some kind of concession on their part, because if now he turns around and then he increases the fuel levy, there'll be an even bigger uproar, you know.
Yes.
And I agree with the Prof that yes, your easy pickings will be sin taxes, but I must say though, he actually was much more lenient than Mboweni, because Mboweni I think in 2021 increased them by about 8%. So he came down to about 6% last year, and I'm sure he'll probably take the similar line. But the reality is that we have households under pressure, any pressure already. We've got fuel price at over, I think it's 21 Rand now. So they would want to, in as much as you play this fine balancing act, to still give something to the general populace.
Yeah.
On the subject of populism, it is sometimes seen as du jour to put the burden on the more wealthy. SARS Commissioner Ed Kesvita has indicated no wealth tax is expected, but do you have any opinions on the likelihood of, say, moves on capital gains tax, property taxes, or dividend taxes?
I suppose it's a possibility, yes.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a semi-hidden way of redistributing.
Yes.
So I think we should look out for that. Again, it won't make a world of difference to the huge requirements. The fuel levy, I don't think we should be too surprised if we don't see a bit of an increase. It's kind of the lesser of all evils in many ways. The other interesting tax point, of course, is the President's reference a couple of weeks ago to a rebate for those households and those businesses that install solar panels. I suppose the Minister will say something about that. We'll get some details there.
Indeed.
And it needs to be meaningful to make it worthwhile. But that doesn't help them. That doesn't help matters. That actually reduces. I mean, if government gives tax rebates, they're losing out on tax income in a certain sense. But the intention was claimed, was stated 14 days ago.
It is also likely a small impact, downward impact on the revenue collection, given how many South Africans would find it affordable to install solar. Let's talk about the most likely source of funding, which will probably be the capital markets, seeking further debt. It's a huge theme for African economies this year. We've already seen Zambia was the first African economy to default on its offshore debt. Ghana thereafter. Luckily for South Africa, our offshore debt is quite limited. We source locally in the main. But interest payments remain the second largest line item in the budget. Are we standing between the devil and the deep blue sea and forced into capital markets quite severely?
We are, but hopefully the temptation to be forced severely will be resisted. The debt situation, the government debt situation, is somewhat enigmatic. The ratio 70-odd% is high. It's not high by world standards.
No.
It's high by our own standards created about 15 years ago, 26%. But I think what's problematic about our government debt is not so much how much it is and how much it's grown, but the fact that a large chunk is being used for, let's say, all the wrong reasons. It's being used to finance current spending, which is non-productive. It's being used to finance part of the civil service wage bill. It's being used to finance part of our social grants. And, as you quite rightly pointed out, a disturbingly large chunk goes towards paying interest, which essentially means that this year, going by last year's figures, for roughly every 100 Rand's worth of tax that we pay, 20 Rand will be used to pay interest on money borrowed by the government a year earlier to finance the interest on money borrowed by the government a year before that, and so we go back. So it's totally unproductive forms of spending. It means take that 20 Rand away, whatever's left, 80 Rand, and only 80 Rand is then left for all the other important things. So, as you quite rightly say, it's an unfortunate, an enviable situation, but we can't afford that government debt to rise to much higher levels.
Treasury's ambition is for government debt to GDP to reach about 63% by the end of the decade.
Yes.
Is that a bit of an ambitious goal?
It is ambitious, it's doable, but at a price. I mean, one of the biggest prices that will be paid, we were referring to a bit earlier, is civil servant salaries. I mean, as you know, for the last couple of years, the stabilization and reduction in that debt is built amongst other things on the assumption of essentially a civil servant wage freeze, which is, of course, again, highly politically contentious.
Well, I want to touch on that, actually. Thank you very much for bringing us there, Prof. One of the things that the MTBPS indicated when it called out those 5 risks was, quote, Any large permanent increases in spending must be matched by permanent increases in revenue or reductions in spending elsewhere, including suspending or terminating programs, end quote. And amongst those that was highlighted was reduction in headcounts or other fiscal measures. As against that, the President hints during SONA that, as we mentioned, some sort of relief or the social reduction in social relief of distress grant will become more permanent as a form of the beginning of a basic income grant. Would a form of a basic income grant, if tabled today, would that be sufficient to stave off the very aggressive wage demands of, for example, SAFTU's 10% increase demand, if we knew that government was at least creating a floor on earnings?
I think from the government side, I think their biggest threat to this government and to our stability is obviously the large number of unemployed youth in this country, which is sitting at over, I think, around about 60%, if you look at it. Now, those are young people who are active, who are not working. And I think for the ANC, they've actually realized that with the introduction of that distress grant, that actually does make a bit of a difference. And actually, if you I go home to the Eastern Cape every festive season, you can even hear the songs that are sung in communities during traditional ceremonies. The reality is that it is making an impact. And I think also within the opposition parties, everyone is warming up to the idea that we do need a basic income grant of sorts. Actually, funnily enough, in its alternative budget, the DA spoke about it and said, actually, we can have a basic income grant. I think what the only differentiator there being the quantum. So I do believe that this time around, probably there will be an announcement to that regard. As to whether it's permanent or not, I'm not sure. But when it comes to COSATU, the reality is that in as much as COSATU may be in a tripartite alliance with the ANC, I think that relationship has actually passed itself by date. Because if you look at how COSATU's posture has been towards the ANC, they've been grossly unhappy. I mean, even I think the last straw was probably the issue of the third year of that three-year wage agreement, which was not effective. Now, if you looked at what the minister said last year, it's quite clear that government departments have to tighten their belts and even pay out people their severance pay.
Early retirement,
so I don't believe that we are going to see any of those demands being met. And I think government has learned from the last wage agreement that 3-year deals don't work, because anything can happen in between, which is actually why at the point where they were supposed to implement the third year of that agreement, they were able to say, we can't afford it. So it's fine to be ambitious to say we want double figures, we want double digits, but the reality is that I don't think they'll walk away with anything probably more than 2%.
And just to add to that, you know, the thing with the social grant is once you start such a system, the recipients become addicted to it. And taking it away is difficult. And again, we link to that.
It's actually a social unrest waiting to happen, pretty much.
So if we consider there are probably close to 20 million recipients, plus, let's say, 2+ million civil servants, it turns out that more than half the population relies on government directly through wages or indirectly through grants for a big part of their survival.
Certainly. In defense of those social grant recipients, I think if they had an economic environment conducive to working, they certainly wouldn't be dependent on it. But
No, I agree with what's being said. I mean, the evidence is starting to emerge that thanks to the social grant, it's only marginal, but even the Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, is showing a slight improvement. But more importantly, the social grant is literally keeping hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people alive. So it makes a great deal of sense.
Minister of Social Development Lindiwe Zulu indicated a number somewhere around 1,200 Rand in an interview recently might be manageable. The question obviously remains about the affordability thereof, and secondly, the extent to which it gets distributed. So we speak about basic income grant, but it's already quite a burden financially for those who are unemployed. Would it be possible for it to be universal in South Africa?
Look, I don't think we'll get to 1,200.
Yeah.
No.
I think for now, what the government will likely do is probably keep it at the 350, but merely extend it.
Okay.
As the Prof is saying, that already you have indicators and markers that are showing us that even that 350 is making some level of some difference to people's lives.
Yes.
So what we was resign ourselves to and accept as South Africans is that it is something that's going to be there for years to come, because I think if you dare touch that 350, that will, what we saw in KZN will probably be a picnic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad you touched on that, because I was about to come to unrest, instability in South Africa, and safety, and departmental priorities that we might hear about, not only in today's speech, but in next week's budget votes in Parliament. We, obviously, every single department will be lobbying for spending in its own space. And it seems as though every single one of them is in crisis. But key ones, you know, Police Minister Beytel has already come out with his crime stats at the end of last week, indicating once again the need for more boots on the ground, more equipment, vehicles for his ministry, or at least for his department. One would probably say the same will come from education, home affairs in particular in terms of safety. And then the other area that I'm curious about, that I think particularly where Africa is in terms of insurgency and political uprising, is our defense ministry. It seems to have been underfunded. Our artillery is quite dated. Whether or not it is receiving enough capacity, attention and finance. I wonder if you have any comments on any one of those, if not all, and if there are any departments that need to be flagged in this particular budget.
Okay. Well, can I kick off with
Please,
the
Professor,
defense?
yes.
Defense has always been obviously controversial. You know what, many would argue it's a state of peace. Why do you need a defense force at all? But let's assume you do need a defense force. Then presumably you want one that works quite well. If you have a look at the resources allocated to defense, now the normal sort of ratio is defense spending as a share of the GDP. And there's a kind of a benchmark across the world of around about 2%, sometimes a bit more. In South Africa's case, it's barely 1.1%. So relative to the rest of the world, we do underspend on defense. You can do the same kind of thing and calculate how much spending per member of society, etc. So defense is, in relative terms, being neglected. I think we see it in terms of having only 2 operational aircraft and only 1.5 operational this, etc., etc. Whether, however, you've got your typical trade-off. It's called the guns versus butter trade-off. More guns means less butter, butter being social spending. And I would imagine in the current circumstances, butter will be a higher priority.
For sure.
Now, butter includes education. I'll just say something about that and then I'll stop talking. As you probably also know, we all know, that the government's budget for education as a share of total spending, in fact, as a share of the GDP, is pretty high by world
Highest
standards.
in OECD, I think, yeah.
It's pretty high. So it's not always a matter of not spending sufficient financial resources on education. Education is a much longer term project. You know, the old cliche, somebody once said, if you want someone with 12 years of education, it takes about 12 years. It's a long term project requiring far more than just financial inputs. I'll end off by pointing out 3 apparently important indicators of decent education. Good quality teachers, which means teachers teaching the right subjects, they're qualified to do so. Good quality school management, from governing body all the way up, and then parental involvement. And sometimes those are the ones lacking, not always the rand and cent,
Sure.
but the application of that. And I'll hand over to you.
Any departmental priorities for you, Sbu?
Look, I think the ratios that have been kept throughout the years will pretty much sustain. I agree that there'll probably be less spending on defense and security. You'll still have education and culture taking a large chunk of that budget, about a quarter thereof.
Yes.
And obviously social spending on social development will get probably will be the second biggest line item in this particular budget. Also considering the fact that government was planning to roll out, to continue rolling out the social distress grants into the future. And I'm sure there'll be a nominal increase, as we always expect, from old age grants, from your child support grants, and such like that. I do feel, though, that we are at a point as South Africa where the issue of national security is becoming an important one that we may have to consider, because one may argue, in the same way that you have a barter versus guns debate, that perhaps we have neglected that element as well, which is why we have these porous borders, which is why our crime rates have actually risen to the level at which they are. So I think at some point it's something that will probably have to be, even if it means within interdepartmentally, they actually reallocate those budgets, but I don't think that we're going to see any increased spending on your defense or even your safety and security side.
For sure. Not to mention insurgencies just on the other side of a border.
Just in Mozambique.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah.
Final question, topic that I think we are all debating the degree of relevance, but it is a hot button topic, which is of course grey listing, which may have impact on our source of funding, particularly if we wanted to tap international markets. The Financial Action Task Force is meeting in Paris this week. The plenary began on Monday, and a decision should be made by day after tomorrow as to whether South Africa will be grey listed. Financial impact that you might see, or at least that would impact the budgets to you, Professor, or investor sentiment, or is it priced in?
That's difficult. I was going to say it's probably been discounted to some extent, and I can't help kind of comparing it with the sometimes notorious credit rating agencies and the way they go about doing things. It's kind of a necessary evil. You need to have a rating. Even a bad rating is probably better than no rating. And I think, the credit ratings agencies, yes, they've downgraded us to junk bond status. I'm not sure it's made a huge difference to the general inflow of portfolio capital. And I think, well, maybe I'm naively optimistic, but maybe the grey listing, if it were to happen, would be treated in the same way. I think when all is said and done, South Africa has built up a wonderful reputation of financial stability, and never, as far as I know, defaulting on loans. Even in the tough old times, we never defaulted. And I think seasoned investors, know that.
But now, grey listing deals much closer, less in terms of creditworthiness, but more in terms of potential graft, money laundering, and so I'll give you the tough one from a political perspective, first geopolitically and then locally in politics. The president is struggling to shake the Phala Phala allegations, which play painfully into this particular grey listing issue. It hasn't been resolved in terms of the Reserve Bank seeking answers as to what happened with foreign exchange found on his farm. And it's, if anything, just not a good look for a country undergoing grey listing review. But from a geopolitical perspective, at the same time, we have these very important visitors in the last month or so. Janet Yellen, the chair of the Federal Committee, the Fed chair of the United States, Sergei Lavrov, the chief diplomat of Russia, both sort of indicating their support in a charm offensive for the continent, but in particular for South Africa. And one can imagine making the red tape for South Africa to access more international capital, potentially from Russia or China, is not an outcome that our Western partners who dominate the Financial Action Task Force would want. Can politics play into our hands here?
I think in fact the charm offensive that we saw with the recently Lavrov, and we also saw the U.S. Secretary of State, and then was also the Secretary for Finance coming into the country. It still underlines for me the importance of South Africa within the global political framework. And I think in as much as Phala Phala may be a topic and may dominate the headlines and even make it to international news channels, but I think in the bigger scheme of things there is general acceptance that perhaps South Africa is in a better position currently, that from a crime fighting point of view, not economically, than probably where it was a few years ago, that there are those moves that are being made to actually make sure that the institutions of democracy are standing and that they are strong. And I think that's not lost on everyone else. But from a global outlook point of view, the reality is that if you look across the spectrum, everyone is going through their own things. They are looking at their own internal issues more than they care about what is happening elsewhere. And I do think that, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, the issue of the debt to GDP ratio. I mean, we may be paying a lot, 20 rand of every 100 rand, but the reality is that if you look at that even in proportion with other countries, it's about around 75%, which is more manageable, I would argue. And also, the fact that we have not defaulted still says that South Africa is a functional country where people can come and invest, and if compare that with Japan, which is what, 266%.
But
I
with
guess
deep savings. But yes. No, I hear you. I think it is only fair. We are it's just about 2 o'clock, and it is 2 o'clock, and Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has entered the chamber. We'll be crossing over into the joint sitting of Parliament at this particular time. Let's hear what Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has to say in National Budget 2023.
For silent prayer and meditation. Please be seated. Order. Order, honorable members. The Secretary will read the first to the third orders together.
Introduction of the Appropriations Bill and tabling of the Division of Revenue Bill. The second order, introductions of the Second Adjustment Appropriation Bill 2022-2023 financial year. The third order of the day, introductions of the ESCOM Debt Relief Bill.
The Honorable, the Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, Refilwe Moloto, His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa, His Excellency the Deputy President Mr. David Mabuza, Cabinet colleagues, members of the Executive Committee for Finance, the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Services, Deputy President of the governing party, Honorable Mashatile, and leaders of all political parties and fellow South Africans. I'm honored to table the following documents before this House. The 2023 Division of Revenue Bill, the 2023 Appropriation Bill, the estimate of national expenditure, the 2023 budget review, the Second Adjustment Appropriation Bill, the ESCOM debt relief, and this budget speech. We're tabling the 2023 budget in a difficult domestic and global economic environment. The global recovery is slowing. Domestically, load shedding has become more persistent and prolonged, impacting on service delivery and threatening the survival of many businesses. This is compounded by the disruption to freight and logistic networks. Households are under pressure from rising cost of living, and unemployment remains stubbornly high. We are navigating this difficult environment with policies that support faster growth and address fiscal risks. Our pursuit of higher growth remains anchored on three pillars: Firstly, we are ensuring a stable macroeconomic environment to create conducive environment for savings, investment, and growth. Secondly, we are implementing growth-enhancing reforms in key sectors, particularly in energy and transport. And thirdly, we are strengthening the capacity of the state to deliver quality public services, invest in infrastructure, and fight crime and corruption. In this budget, we are allocating additional resources towards these endeavors without compromising the sustainability of public finances. Since 2022 budget, global growth estimates for 2023 have been revised downward. The International Monetary Fund projects global growth to slow from an estimated 3.4% in 2022 to 2.9% in 2023. Global economic risks remain high, including those relating to the ongoing war in Ukraine, and could impede growth if they materialize. The reopening of the Chinese economy, however, may offer some reprieve by supporting a stronger rebound in global trade and demand. South Africa's economy grew by an estimated 2.5% in 2022. This is an upward revision from the 1.9% projection in the 2022 medium-term budget policy statement, reflecting a better than expected outcome in the third quarter of 2022. At 4.6 trillion, the size of the economy in 2022 was far bigger than the pre-pandemic levels in real terms. This is evidence of a robust economic recovery, even in the face of lingering COVID-19 scarring. However, the medium-term growth outlook has deteriorated. The real GDP growth is projected to average 1.4% from 2023 to 2025, compared with 1.6% estimated in October. Madam Speaker, in these conditions, government must maintain a prudent fiscal stance. The fiscal consolidation strategy we adopted several years ago has, one, restrained growth mainly in consumption expenditure, and two, allowed us to use part of higher than expected revenues to reduce the deficit. As a result, we're bringing the fiscal deficit down without resorting to tax increases or further cuts in social wage and infrastructure. A primary fiscal surplus will be achieved in the current financial year, and this will be maintained over the medium term. This is a critical policy stance. In addition, we must consider the consolidated position, which includes debt service cost. In this regard, the consolidated fiscal deficit is projected at 4.2% of GDP for 2022-23, and this will reach 3.2% in 2025-26. These figures include the impact of the partial takeover of Eskom debt, which I will elaborate on later. Mainly due to the Eskom debt relief, government debt will stabilize at a higher level of 73.6% of GDP in 2025-26. This is 3 years later than anticipated in the 2022 medium-term budget policy statement. In general, government debt is high. The gross debt stock is projected to increase from 4.73 trillion in 2022-23 to 5.84 trillion in 2025-26. And because debt is high, our debt service costs are also high. Debt service costs are projected to average 366.8 billion annually over the medium term, reaching 397.1 billion in 2025-26. These are resources that could otherwise be used to address pressing social needs or to invest in our future. There are risks to the fiscal outlook. These include a worsening of the economic outlook, a further weakening of the finances of state-owned companies, and a possible unaffordable public service wage agreement. If these risks materialize, they will require us to make difficult budget trade-offs. For these reasons, we must continue exercising fiscal restraint. Accordingly, government non-interest spending will be kept below the level of revenue into the future, and will continue targeting the stabilization of debt. Madam Speaker, eradicating poverty, inequality, and unemployment is as urgent, if not more so, as it was at the dawn of our democracy nearly 30 years ago. A growing economy is key to achieve this objective. Implementing growth-enhancing reforms is a crucial element of our growth strategy. To fast-track the implementation of these reforms, we initiated Operation Vulindlela, a joint initiative of the Presidency and National Treasury to accelerate the implementation of structural reforms by fostering collaboration and coordination across the government, just over 2 years ago. Since its inception, Operation Vulindlela has made progress in fast-tracking reforms in priority areas of electricity, water, telecommunications, transport, and immigration. In water, the backlog of water license applications has been cleared, and new licenses now are being issued within 90 days. Later this year, we will table a law to establish an infrastructure agency to leverage the assets in the water sector for increased investment in water resources infrastructure. In digital communication, we will soon switch off the analog signal and finalize the migration to digital signal. This will unlock the benefits of the spectrum auction and unleash renewed investment in the sector. We are introducing new regulations to enable the accelerated rollout of telecommunications infrastructure. We are clearing the backlog in work visas application and are implementing the recommendations of the Skilled Immigration Review. Despite these gains, the challenges in electricity and logistics threaten to undermine the reform agenda. Madam Speaker, the lack of reliable electricity supply is the biggest economic constraint. Record levels of load shedding were experienced in 2022. I'm told 207 days of load shedding compared to 75 days in 2021. In response, we are acting decisively to bring additional capacity onto the grid. We are also working to transform the electricity sector to achieve energy security in the long term. As part of this, during the medium-term budget policy statement, we announced that the government will take over a portion of Eskom's debt. We are doing this for two reasons. Firstly, doing so will ease pressure on the company's balance sheet, enabling it to invest in transmission and distribution infrastructure. It will also allow Eskom to conduct maintenance required to improve the availability of electricity. Secondly, 337 billion of Eskom's debt is already government guaranteed. Explicitly taking on this debt will reduce fiscal risk and enhance long-term fiscal sustainability. We are proposing a total debt relief arrangement for Eskom of 254 billion rand. This consists of two components. One is 184 billion rand. This represents Eskom's full debt settlement requirements in 3 tranches over the medium term. Second is a direct takeover of up to 70 billion of Eskom's loan portion in 2025-26. Because of the structure of the debt relief, Eskom will not need further borrowing during this period. Government will finance the arrangements through the 66 billion baseline provision announced in the 2019 budget and 118 billion in additional borrowing over the next 3 years. Honourable members, the arrangement is accompanied by strict conditions to safeguard public funds. These conditions include, amongst others, requiring Eskom to prioritize capital expenditure in transmission and distribution during the debt relief period, and for the company to focus on maintenance of the existing generation fleet to improve availability of electricity. That the debt relief be used to settle debt and interest payment only, and that Eskom implement recommendations emanating from an independent assessment of its operations, which has been commissioned by the National Treasury. Details of the debt relief and the reasoning behind these conditions are set out in full in the online annexure, what is called W3. At the end of December 2022, municipalities owed Eskom 56.3 billion, and the debt is rising. Undertaking a debt relief for Eskom of this magnitude without addressing this particular risk would be counterproductive. We are working with Eskom to provide solution to this problem, wherein Eskom will provide incentivized relief to municipalities whose debt is unaffordable. However, the relief will come with conditions, and to avoid a repeat of debt built up over time, the relief will attach measures, including installation of prepaid meters to correct the underlying behavior of non-payment and underlying behavior of non-payment and operational practices in these municipalities. Eskom's long-term financial viability depends on its customers paying their dues. National Treasury will publish details for assessing the debt relief in a circular in March 2023. Implementation will start from the 1st of April. More generally, the culture of non-payment, not only by municipalities, but all organs of state and individual household customers, is concerning. Such a behavior undermines and cripples our institutions and makes it impossible for them to deliver services. To change this, the National Treasury is exploring ways to encourage all to improve their behavior and do the right thing. Madam Speaker, the energy and electricity sector here at home and globally is undergoing a rapid process of systematic change. Green technologies are becoming cheaper, and the deployment of low carbon solution is accelerating. We recognize that we have a role to play in encouraging adaptation and mitigation. I'm pleased to announce 2 tax measures to encourage businesses and individuals to invest in renewable energy and increase electricity generation. From the 1st of March 2023, businesses will be able to reduce their taxable income by 125% of the cost of investment in renewables. There will be no thresholds on the size of the projects that qualify, and the incentive will be available for 2 years to stimulate investment in the short term. As announced by the President, we will also introduce a new tax incentive for individuals to install rooftop solar panels to reduce pressure on the grid and help ease load shedding. Individuals who install rooftop solar panels from 1st of March 2023 will be able to claim a rebate of 25% of the cost of the panel, up to a maximum of 15,000. This can be used to reduce their tax liability in 2023-24 tax year. This incentive will be available for 1 year. Changes to the bounce back loan guarantee scheme are also proposed to incentivize renewable energy, rooftop solars, and address energy-related constraints experienced by small and medium enterprises. Government will guarantee solar-related loans for small and medium enterprises on a 20% first loss basis National Treasury will launch the Energy Bounce Back Scheme on the 1st of April. More broadly, part of addressing the persistent electricity supply shortage must involve implementing a just transition to low-carbon economy. Climate change poses considerable risks and constraints to sustainable economic growth in South Africa. We are among the most water-scarce countries in the world, and recent events have shown that extreme weather events such as floods, heat waves, and drought are occurring more often, and their intensity is worsening. Our Just Energy Transition Plan addresses these urgent climate changes. It aims to significantly lower emission of greenhouse gases and harnesses investment in new energy technologies, electric vehicles, and energy efficiency appliances. Most importantly, it ensures that communities tied to high-emitting energy industries are not left behind and are provided with the new skills and new economic and employment opportunities. Through the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, launched by the President in 2022 at COP27, the country will make significant investment in our economy over the next 5 years, supported by a coherent industrial policy to enable innovation and economic diversification. International Partners Group of Developed Economies in 2021 pledged $8.5 billion to support South Africa's transition. This will go a long way. South Africa, through the role in G20, the IMF, and the World Bank, has stressed that developed nations could do more to support the energy transition of developing nations, especially by ensuring that the financial support included a much larger grant funding component. Infrastructure investment lays the foundation for inclusive and sustainable growth. They address supply-side constraints and expand access to basic services. Overall, the public sector is projected to spend 903 billion rand in infrastructure over the medium term. The largest portion of this, around 448 billion, will be spent by state-owned companies, public entities, and through public-private investment partnerships. These spending plans are mostly for strategic projects in the following sectors. Transport and logistics will spend an estimated 351.1 billion, including for Nsaral to improve the road infrastructure network. Water and sanitation is planned to spend 132.5 billion over the next 3 years, mainly by the water boards. As we undertake infrastructure projects, we need to crack down on criminality in the construction sector. The extortion and intimidation of lawfully appointed contractors and the workers they employ cannot be tolerated. Madam Speaker, allow me to highlight a few of shovel-ready projects approved through the budget facility for infrastructure. The 488-bed Limpopo Central Hospital will finally begin in construction in March this year. Phase 2 of the Welisizwe Rural Bridges program breaks ground in April this year. It plans to install 96 bridges annually to enable rural communities in the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Free State, and Northwest to safely access schools and workplaces. 308 billion rand is allocated for the program over the medium term. The Sol Plaatje municipality will repair aspects of the Riverton water supply scheme, which is the only water source and supply system to Kimberley. The construction of the enabling bulk infrastructure such as roads, water components for Lufereng mixed-use development in Gauteng begins in June 2023. It will support development of 31,000 mixed housing units. Access roads for the Mzumvu water project are nearing completion. The construction of the Ndabelanga Dam will begin this year. Additional funding during the next financial year may be required to ramp up implementation. Site establishment for the Kenwelliam Dams project in Western Cape is completed. Early construction works include surface preparations are underway. Our focus is not only on building new infrastructure, but also on maintaining existing infrastructure. We do this to ensure that it lasts long and performs according to the required standard. At the same time, we're looking at initiatives to leverage private sector resources in public infrastructure delivery. This is to strengthen state capacity to expand infrastructure delivery and to catalyze private finances. Initiatives include funding development of continuous, investable, and transparent pipeline projects and programs, fast-tracking the implementation of the public-private partnerships regulatory framework recommendations, pilot the implementation of conditional grant pledging that will enable that we announced during the medium-term budget policy statement. It is aimed to ensure the rollout of infrastructure is not constrained by availability of funds, in particular if there is capacity to deliver. This is what some of the provinces are calling the front-loading. The Division of Revenue Bill is amended accordingly to give effect to that proposal. Interventions in supporting growth are critical to the health and sustainability of the economy. They need to be complemented by a policy environment that promotes the performance of productive sectors in an integrated way. This will require difficult but necessary trade-offs to ensure that the appropriate support is properly targeted at the correct product and value chain. Let me now turn to the revenue outlook and tax proposals. I know that's what gets people worried when I come to this term. Tax revenue collections for 2022-23 are expected to total 1.69 trillion. This exceeds the 2022 budget estimate by 93.7 billion. And the 2022 medium-term budget policy estimate by 10.3 billion. Over the medium-term, revenue projections are 6 billion higher than the estimate of the 2022 medium-term budget policy statement. As a result, there are no major tax proposals in this budget. There are major tax proposals in this budget. I can see everybody's happy. The improvement in revenue is due to higher collection in corporate and personal income taxes and in custom duties. This is partially offset by the lower value-added tax estimate. Madam Speaker, our country is reaping the benefits of more efficient and effective tax administration. This formulation is not mine, it's plagiarism. It belongs to the commissioner. Always emphasize when we talk. Now we ask for tips. Nilesh Solanki from Gauteng was one of the nearly 2,000 South Africans that submitted a tip for the 2023 budget tips competition. He asked that we consider no increase in tax rates. Nilesh, you'll be happy to know that 2023-24, government will provide, instead of increasing, a tax relief of 13 billion rand. In addition to the tax measures I have announced to promote investment in renewable energy, the general fuel levy and the road accident fund levy will not be increased this year. Man, the generous, you don't clap again. To ease the impact on the electricity crisis on food prices, the refund on the road accident fund levy for diesel used in manufacturing process, such as for generators, will be extended to manufacturers of foodstuffs. This will take place from the 1st of April in 1st of April 2023 for 2 years. The personal income tax bracket will be adjusted for inflation, which will increase the tax-free threshold. When I say it's adjusted for inflation, it doesn't mean I'm increasing it. It means I'm relieving people and moving higher up. The threshold for tax-free was 95,000. Now I'm increasing it. So even if you are bound 91,000, we are 95,000 now, you start getting taxed. Medical tax credit will also be increased by inflation to 364 per month for the first 2 members and to 246 per month for additional members. The retirement tax table for lump sum withdrawn before retirement and for lump sum withdrawn at the retirement will be adjusted upwards by 10%. This is also a benefit. This means that tax-free amount that can be withdrawn at retirement increases to 550,000. The brackets of the transfer duty table will also be increased by 10%, allowing properties below 1.1 million to avoid any transfer duty payments. The research and development tax incentive will be extended for 10 years and will be refined to make it simpler and more effective. The urban development zone tax incentive will also be extended by 2 years to allow for the review of the incentive to be completed. After further consultation, the government intends to publish revised draft legislation on the two-pot retirement system. This will include details on the amount that could be immediately available when the system is implemented from 1st of March 2024. Any withdrawals from the accessible saving point will be taxed as income in the year of withdrawal. And after a review and consultation last year, and taking into account the impact of the Upstream Petroleum Resource Development Bill, the minimum royalty rate for oil and gas companies will be increased to 2%. The maximum rate of 5% remains unchanged. Due to difficult operating environment for the sugar industry, from the impact of flooding, social unrest, the health promotion levy will remain unchanged for the following 2 fiscal years. To enable the industry to diversify, restructure, government proposes an increase in the excise duties of alcohol and tobacco of 4.9%, in line with the expected inflation. This means that a 340 milliliter can of beer increases by 10 cents. A 750 milliliter bottle of wine goes by 18 cents. A 750 milliliter bottle of spirits, Salimala. A 750 milliliter bottle of spirit will increase by 3.9. No sympathy for smokers. No sympathy for smokers. A 23-gram cigar, Bakala this side, will increase by 5 rand 47 cents. And on a pack of 20 cigarettes, the duty rises 98 cents. On illicit trade, over the past 3 years, SARS has taken several steps to enhance its effectiveness in combating illicit trade, particularly in tobacco. To this end, SARS has completed 2,316 seizures of cigarette and tobacco products to the value of 598.8 million. An additional 18 billion worth of schedules and assessment have been raised targeting syndicated tobacco-related crimes. Furthermore, SARS has collected more than 1.2 billion in revenue and handed over 92 cases for criminal proceeding with the NPA, of which resulted in successful conviction related to tobacco smuggling syndicates. Madam Speaker, let me come to the juicy part. Madam Speaker, the 2023 budget proposal reflects the government's priority by making targeted allocation for specific programs. Over the medium term, more than 60% of the non-interest spending goes to the social wage, while spending on buildings and other fixed structures such as roads and dams will increase from 62 billion in the current financial year to 104 billion in the medium term. We're increasing allocation to key frontline departments above existing baseline, moving towards a change in the composition of spending from consumption to investment, maintaining a large social security safety net while striving for sustainable levels of debt. This is not an austerity budget. It is a budget that makes tough trade-offs in the interest of the country's short and long-term prosperity. In 2023 budget allocation allocates additional funding totaling 227 billion rand over the medium term. There are several priorities that will be funded through this additional money. 66 billion is allocated to social development over the medium term, with 36 billion rand going to the COVID-related, SRD, at Takastat, Bati Ramaphosa. R36 billion is for SRD. 30 billion rand is used for inflation-linked increases for Ogogo. The old age and disability grant increases by 90 rand from the 1st of April, and a further 10 rand by the 1st of October. The result is a total increase to 2,090 by the end of October, what they will be earning. The child support grant rises from 480 to 510 from the 1st of October, while the foster care grant increases from 1,070 to 1,130 over the same period. 23 billion and 22 billion will be allocated to health and basic education, respectively, to cover the shortfall in compensation budgets and to improve services. 8 billion is allocated for basic services through the local government equitable share. We have allocated 14 billion over the medium term to fight crime and corruption, with the following specific allocation. The South African Police Service is allocated 7.8 billion to appoint 5 police trainees per year over the next 3 years, which means a total of 15,000. The National Prosecuting Authority receives 1.3 billion to support the implementation of the recommendation of the State Capture Commission. And the Financial Action Task Force, the Financial Intelligence Center has allocated additional 265.3 million to tackle organized and financial crime. The Special Investigation Unit is allocated 100 million to initiate civil litigations in the Special Tribunal. Flowing from the proclamation linked to the recommendation of the State Capture Commission, discussions are taking place on funding for other departments, including Parliament, that need to implement these recommendations. I'm aware that Parliament has also revised this budget that we must take into account is the implementation of the State Capture Commission. That matter is being looked at. The Department of Defense is allocated an additional 3.1 billion rand to enhance security on the South African borders. Finally, an injection, in the light of what I've said by the work SARS has got to do, an injection into the budget of SARS is proposed in addition to a direct allocation for capital and ICT projects, provisional allocations are set aside to improve revenue-raising capability of SARS. I'm also tabling the second adjustment appropriation bill for the 22-23 fiscal year. The bill proposes an allocation of 45.6 billion rand to provide for the carry-through cost of the 2022-23 public service wage increase. 1 billion is allocated to South African Airways to assist the carrier with the business rescue process closure. The South African Post Office allocated 2.4 billion. The allocation for the state-owned companies will be accompanied by strict conditions to ensure sustainability, accountability, and transparency. If these conditions are not met, the unfortunate thing is that funds will not flow. Madam Speaker, the budget provides for carry-through costs, as I've indicated, of the 2022-23 wage increase. In addition, the budget includes pay progression, a housing allowance, and other benefits for civil servants. The budget also provides additional funding for safety and security, education and health. In health, the funds are to hire new staff, address the shortfall in the compensation budget, and retain additional health workers appointed during the pandemic, as well as to clear the backlog in health services. As for the wage negotiations that just commenced, the budget does not preempt the outcomes. It is an agreement between ourselves and the unions in the summit in March last year that they say if we put up a number before the negotiations, we're preempting the negotiation process. Our ideal view was that we should have concluded last year's negotiations by June so that July last year we've commenced with 2023. Unfortunately, things did not work that way. So, nevertheless, these future wage negotiations must strike a balance between fair pay, fiscal sustainability, and the need for additional staff in the frontline services. An unbudgeted wage settlement will require very significant trade-offs in government spending because the wage bill consumes a significant portion of the budget. It will mean that funds must be clawed back in other ways. Mainly, this will mean restricting the ability of department entities to fill non-critical posts. It will also mean achieving cost savings from major rationalization of state entities and programs. As indicated by the President in the SONA, the National Treasury and the President, National Treasury has already identified where large savings can be achieved. In this regard, during the upcoming financial year, the National Treasury will work with the Presidency on concrete proposals to achieve savings by rationalization or closing public entities. Recommendations will be made to the President and Cabinet and should form part of the next budget. In relation to the recent floods and the national disaster declared in various provinces, let me just pause. Let me do that off-ramping because it's quite important here to explain because there's a failure to understand and therefore a failure to respond. There are two components to a disaster. The first one is called an emergency relief. What are the emergency relief? Some people who need some food here, we need shelter here, we need medical attention there. That thing needs immediate response. Last year, we had 1 billion rand in 4 grants. That 1 billion was depleted, but during the adjustment estimate, we replenished that emergency grant, and we now have 695 million in that emergency grant. What that means, the people who are sitting in halls and other things must access this money so that they must get temporary accommodation, must get food, must get into. That's the first part. The second part of the disaster is what is called recovery and repair. To do that, you need skilled people than myself, more skilled than myself, who can go into a bridge and assess the cost to build that bridge. And then you submit a proper budget, and that is affected into the normal budget process. That's what we would appeal to the current provinces which are facing disaster. The money is available for immediate emergency relief. We must work together to make sure that communities are attended with speed. So a further 1 billion will be available next year for emergency relief. The emergency relief, as I've investigated, the emergency response also requires provinces and municipalities to reprioritize existing allocations to cater for immediate needs affecting communities, such as temporary shelter. I've done that, I've made reference. The contingency reserve will also be used to fund emergency responses, including as undertaken by the Defense Force. As it pertains to recovery and repair, I've also explained that, which relates to longer-term rehabilitation that will be factored into the normal budget process. So that is what we appeal should be done. Funding for this rehabilitation will also be done through the normal process. Move. South Africa has been a voluntary member of the Financial Action Task Force since 2003, which sets global standards to combat money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Across national budgets, across national borders, in 2021, FATF published its mutual evaluation report highlighting vulnerabilities in the country's anti-money laundering system. We have since made substantial progress to address these weaknesses. 2 laws have been enacted to address the technical deficiencies in the legislative framework, namely the General Laws Amendment Act of 2022, the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorism and Related Activism Amendment Act. I must at this stage pause and thank the honorable members for the speed with which these pieces of legislation were processed. We thank all honorable members for the effort they've taken into that. Were it not for that speed, we probably be still struggling now in arguing our case in FATF. The laws address 15 of the 20 legislative deficiencies identified by FATF. The remaining 5 deficiencies will be addressed through regulation and practices that do not require legislation. We recognize the need to be more effective in implementing our laws, particularly in fighting organized and sophisticated crimes. Addressing the FATF issues is part of the broader fight against corruption, crime, state capture, and the deliberate weakening of the institutions of law and order in our country. The FATF plenary will make its decision later this week on whether or not to put South Africa under increased monitoring, otherwise known as grey listing. We should be prepared for that possibility. The 2023 budget increases allocation for all spheres of government to assist with urgent spending pressures. Relative to the 2022 budget, direct provincial allocations increased by 92.7 billion to 2.17 trillion over the medium term. The increase consists of 76.9 billion added to the provincial equitable share and 15.8 billion added to the direct conditional grants. Local government allocation will increase by a total of 14.3 billion, made up of 18.1 billion in local government equitable share and 6.2 billion in direct conditional grants. This takes the total direct allocation to local government to 522 billion rand over the same period. These allocations alleviate some of the financial pressures, particularly in health, education, and free basic service where the cost of providing services are rising. Madam Speaker, our economy is facing significant risk. Uncertainty is on the rise. It requires us to be bold, to do bold things, to put the fear of failure aside and execute the difficult trade-offs needed to get from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. The measures in this budget reflect these realities and the need to act boldly. Madam Speaker, I'm grateful to the President and Deputy President for their support and the leadership. Thank you for the Deputy Minister of Finance and the National Treasury team led by the Acting Director General. My sincere thanks to the Commissioner of South African Revenue Services and the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank. Let me also thank my colleagues in the Ministers' Committee on Budget and the members of the Budget Council from the provinces who shared the load of tough decisions that have to be made. Similarly to the Parliamentary Committee of Finance and Appropriation, and I express my sincere appreciation. My gratitude also goes to Neil Bell from the Parliamentary Bills Office. He retires in May this year after 41 years of going the extra mile to support the passing and the tabling of the budget and other legislation in Parliament. Mr. Bell, we say a bells to you, and thousands of public servants who work behind the scenes to keep our country going. Let me thank each of you South Africans for the support. Sashe Yewani, we thank you. Nyazingban. Kumamchawe. For the continued support under the difficult circumstances of managing the finances of this province. So, thank you very much. That is your budget, Madam Speaker.
Order, honorable members. I thank the Minister. The papers tabled by the Minister will be referred to the relevant committees. Order. Order, Minister.
Welcome back to EWN's live budget coverage of the National Budget Speech 2023. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has just concluded a rather quick delivery of relatively good news, we would probably say. I hope you're with us from before when we gave some of our projections, many of which have come through quite strongly from both Professor Andre Roux of Stellenbosch Business School joining us here, as well as EWN's Editor-in-Chief Sbu Ngalwa, who are with me in studio. We'll take you through some of the good news. First and foremost, just as I know you're all waiting to hear, some 6 billion rand of revenue overruns have given us a decent amount of tax relief this year. There is a solution on Eskom, which we will table for you shortly. However, our colleague Lindsay Dentlinger is right outside the City Hall, which of course is our house of the joint sitting of Parliament at this time, with some reaction from some opposition parties. Lindsay, take it away. What are some of our opposition leaders saying with response to the budget we just heard from Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana?
Well, as no increases in the fuel and the RAF levies, so that is a bit of a help. And there's an extra 30...
Sorry, Mr. Swart, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Halfway.
With me, I have the ACDP Steve Swart to summarize his views for us on the budget that was delivered by the Finance Minister this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Swart, for your time. Your views on the budget delivered this afternoon.
Well, the ACDP is deeply concerned about the increase in public debt levels and the debt service costs that are crowding out expenditure on other much-needed items like education, like health and policing. If you look at the additional debt now that is taken on by the sovereign debt from Eskom, an extra 184 billion rand and another 70 billion rand, 254 debt, R1 billion debt, which means that the total debt is going to escalate over the medium term to 5.4 trillion rand. Now, the debt service costs are about 366 billion rand per year, which crowds out other expenditure. However, of course, there is good news. And the good news is that there has been a tax windfall of almost 100 billion rand. That's tax that has been collected over and above that was projected in last year's budget. And that means there's no increase in personal tax, corporate tax or the VAT, and no increase in fuel levy and the RAF levy. And that's to be welcomed, plus additional expenditure on the social distress relief for the poorest of the poor. So it's a tough budget, but we are looking at how the expenditure is going to be done in a proper and meaningful manner.
Mr. Swart, the energy crisis, giving Eskom all that money, is that the answer to dealing with our energy shortage?
Well, as you know, I was deeply involved in the Eskom energy inquiry at Parliament, and I am concerned that that money that is being given now and the additional debt that the sovereign debt is taken on must be properly spent. And we need to be able to monitor from Parliament side how that money is spent. And it is a concern because we've seen over the years more and more money is being given to Eskom, but it's not been properly spent. So we've got to ensure that it is properly spent because it is at the cost of every taxpayer. But we know that load shedding must come to an end so that we can have increased economic growth, which will increase revenues and increase jobs in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swart. I think we have the UDM's Ngabayomzi Kwankwa stepping up to speak to us. Mr. Kwankwa, the solutions that the minister has presented to Eskom's energy crisis, does that satisfy you given what the president had said in his State of the Nation address?
Well, in the first place, they have extended government guarantees to almost 400 billion rands at Eskom, and that was not enough to solve the problem. And now we think that by doling out more money to Eskom, we're going to solve the problem without addressing the underlying challenges facing the entity, which have to do with governance and leadership. The bottom line, I don't think we have the right people to run the entity at all. We have the necessary expertise to be able to turn Eskom around. It doesn't help now doling money out to Eskom, but also I think a bigger problem is that we need to have a rules-based fiscal regime when it comes to debt. We must set limits, otherwise the government will continue to play yo-yo with the public debt. We don't know which limit is the right limit, which limit we should be capping our public debt on. It seems like every time there's a problem, then they're going to load it on the public debt, and that becomes our problem because what we're actually doing in essence, we're stealing our children's future because we're using their money for the future to pay for current expenses, which is wrong.
There's a revenue windfall, but is it something to be celebrated given the fact that so much of it is going to go to paying debt?
But the revenue windfall is like sheer luck. It's actually God smiling at us. It's nothing that they've done properly. It's because of especially commodities doing well. It has nothing to do with the government being able to plan for economy proactively. The government should actually start using that money to invest it targetedly in the economy to make sure that we're able to grow the economy. Because the only way we're going to be able to reduce debt in the short to medium term without actually servicing the debt is that we need to grow the size of our economy so that the debt to GDP ratio actually improves.
What everybody's focus is on Eskom, SAA. The minister had previously spoken about tough love, no more money for SOEs, but we have R1 billion going to SAA when they vehemently said in previous years they would not be giving SAA any more money.
They gave them a Valentine's gift and yet they've been saying they are going to give them tough love. But also you need to ask the question, what is the role of this private equity partner if money for SAA is going to continue coming from government? It makes no absolute sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. In fact, it's like giving 2.4 billion rands to the post office. To do what? I mean, the post office has really become irrelevant as an entity now. But also, I mean, the last time they made a profit was in 2004. I mean, President Beg was still in charge back then. I mean, how many presidents have we had since then? The institution has collapsed completely, and I don't think there's an ability or even a political will on the part of our government to actually restore it and turn it around.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kwankwa. Stepping up for us now, Refilwe, we have Mr. Brett Heron from the Good Party. Brett, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. What are the positives you take from today's speech?
Well, I think the unexpected increase in economic growth to 2.5%, that's a positive. The increased tax collection, which is a result of efficiencies at SARS, those are positives. But I think that the disappointment is that those windfalls, which were unexpected, are not really benefiting the people most in need in our country. So I'm disappointed that the social relief of distress grant of 350 Rand per month is still regarded as a temporary grant that will end in 2024. I'm disappointed that it's still 350 Rand per month, despite some hint by the President last week that there would be an increase in that grant. And I'm disappointed that we're not thinking about a basic income grant in the long term. So the windfalls and the positives that came out of extra cash and extra finances is not benefiting those who need it most. If we think about the energy solution and the energy crisis, this rooftop revolution, which really could help South Africa overcome its energy crisis, the tax incentive of 15,000 Rand for solar panels as a maximum tax incentive is also something that will only benefit wealthy families, because to install a solar system in your house is astronomically expensive. We're looking at 200,000 Rand for a middle income home to go off the grid to install a solar panel system with batteries and with an inverter. So it's a meaningless gesture that is not really going to transform our energy crisis or introduce renewable energy into the homes and small businesses as is expected.
Should government have bailed out the post office again, and also SAA when it previously said it wouldn't do so again?
Well, in the absence of understanding the restructuring of SAA and its future and the business rescue process, the 1 billion Rand doesn't really make sense, because what we need is transparency from the Minister of Public Enterprises as to this transaction that has been hanging in the air now for almost 2 years, where the majority share in SAA would be sold to a private consortium. Once we get that understanding, we can then assess whether the 1 billion Rand is warranted and needed. So it's difficult to comment on the 1 billion Rand because it seems like something that is lacking context, and we really need the Minister of Public Enterprises to come clean now on this privatization of SAA and whether any additional funding is required. My understanding was that SAA was now moving into a profitable trading position, and that was what was reported last week in the media, and so this 1 billion Rand makes no sense in that context.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brett Heron from the Good Party. Refilwe, I have standing by now the Freedom Front Plus leader, Dr. Peter Groenewald. Good afternoon, Mr. Groenewald. Thank you for your time. What do you think of yet another bailout for Eskom? Is it the way to deal with our energy crisis?
Well, of course, we must deal with the crisis. And actually the government had no option. But we must remember, in the end, it is taxpayers that is solving that problem again. And I think it is unfair. For instance, if we go and look at municipalities, 54 billion in arrears, in effect, it means that the taxpayer now have to subsidize for those people not paying for their services. That on the one hand. But people must not be misled. South Africa is in deep trouble. If we, for instance, looked at the government debt, it increased from 4.7 trillion over the period to 5.84 trillion. The service cost alone is 366 billion annually of that debt. So we are in deep trouble. Referring to Eskom and even other state-owned enterprises, we in the Freedom Front Plus had said on numerous occasions, the solution is to privatize. The taxpayers are paying dearly for the inability of the government to effectively manage SOEs, and we have to pay that price.
Mr. Groenewald, your thoughts on the social wage. That is also growing by the day. There is no conversion quite yet of the COVID relief grant to a basic income grant. That would also mean that personal income tax individuals will be taxed more. Where do you think government should go in that social net of keeping people who are out of work to be able to give them something to put food on the table?
Well, what they must do, they must ensure that the economy grow. Because if the economy grow, we can create more job opportunities and the unemployment rate can be less. That is the solution. But what is happening now, and we said that from the start, they started with the COVID of 350 Rand relief, that the government, once they started with that, they won't be able to withdraw that. And that is part of the election for 2024 as well. There's no way the ANC government will now say that we're going to stop it. Even if you look at all the other social grants that has been given, you know, it's disturbing that we must hear that about 48% of people in South Africa is dependent on some other form of social grant in South Africa. We are becoming a social dependent state, and there are only few people who can afford to pay taxes, and in the end, not even they will be able to pay that, so it's not sustainable. The government must ensure that they create conditions where we can develop our economy and attract investors to come and invest in South Africa, and I didn't see it in this budget, also not the previous one, and I'm not sure whether we're going to see it in the next one, except after 2024 when there's a new government.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Peter, Dr. Groenewald from the Freedom Front Plus. I think we're going to leave it there for the moment. Refilwe, back to you in studio.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that reaction. We heard from the Freedom Front Plus as well as Good Party telling us some of their reactions to what we heard from Enoch Godongwana, the Finance Minister, in the National Budget. I'm very eager to hear from my guests here in studio, Professor Andre Roux, economist and futurist from Stellenbosch Business School, as well as our Editor-in-Chief here at EWN, Sibu Ngalwa. Quite an interesting budget that we got there. I imagine the most detail that we got and that we should begin with, of course, would be the resolution that have been come to on Eskom. Prof, I think you had said so in our pre-game that we expected government to have no room but to bail Eskom out. Your thoughts?
Yes, you're right. I think overall, if you look at the big picture, I think more or less as expected, no big surprises, not particularly painful either. But as always, there are so many different stakeholders, so many people desiring different things. It's impossible to satisfy everybody. The one thing that does concern me a little bit is perhaps that a lot of the budget, the seemingly good outcomes, are based on some very specific assumptions. There could be risks, assumptions regarding economic growth. I see that Treasury's growth forecasts are a bit higher than that of the Reserve Bank, for instance. Hopefully Treasury is right, but there's always a chance that could be lower. It's also, I think, based on the not the possibility, the assumption, and here we go again, the civil service wage bill would not rise all that significantly. Again, perhaps a very brave assumption. Overall, I don't think too bad. The government debt ratio is going to rise a bit quicker than we thought, or only start stabilizing a few years after we had hoped. That's understandable, given the fact that they've taken over a big chunk of Eskom's debt.
For sure.
It shouldn't be a big surprise. Whereas I think at this stage one has generally satisfied feelings. I think by and large on the side of austerity, which is called for, without compromising the social wage.
Now, the minister would argue with you, he was at pains to emphasize that this is not an austere budget, and I imagine that has everything to do with these very stakeholders that need to be pleased, wouldn't you say, Sbu? How do you think this will be received by various stakeholders in the country?
Actually, I was listening to some of the reaction from some of the political parties, and they were not as scathing as I thought they would be. They were actually quite receptive to this budget, and I guess you mentioned earlier that it was actually quite short, and perhaps it's because he just had to get to the point and less flowery language and just deal with the issues. I mean, I think Skosatu is still going to respond, but I think from the general sense I'm getting from opposition parties, it looks like while they might be unhappy about certain things, but it looks like it's a budget that was well received. I must say though, one would have hoped that in terms of the rebates that he announced for installation of solar for businesses, it looks good because you can claim up to 125% of the cost. One would have hoped that it actually would have done more for households. 25% is still something, but the cost is still very much prohibitive. But I think he touched on the areas that we expected him to. I mean, there's no increase on the fuel levy, and also the extension of the social relief grant to 2024, end of March. I'm sure even next year they'll probably extend it, depending if the ANC is in government. That's if.
Yes. So let's stay there in terms of share of pocket that's been relieved by Treasury on both business owners and consumers. So as you rightly say, Sbu, up to 125% rebate for you if you're a business owner in your first year for all renewable energy projects, and as you say, much more narrow for households insofar as it's only in the the voltaic space, in other words, solar space, and only for solar panels. The rebate is capped at 15,000 Rand. You'll have to pay out upfront and then can claim it back in the following tax year, up to 25% of that spending. And again, specifically, the catch is that it's only for the solar panels, and we obviously know that batteries and inverters tend to take up a great deal of the cost. So relief, but a relief amongst the more wealthy amongst us, I guess.
And it doesn't help cash flow either. You've got to wait a year.
Correct. But for, let's maybe say, the relief of the broader populace, let's talk a little bit about the contingent bailout for Eskom. Of the sort of 423 billion Rand, I almost said dollar, debt, it's our economy, 423 billion Rand debt that Eskom is facing. The proposal is of about just under half of that, to over half of that, 254 billion Rand, 70 billion of which is taking on Eskom's loan portfolio, 184 billion Rand of which will be the full debt settlement over 3 tranches in the medium term. Something similar to what we saw, I think, in a 2019 resolution, should free up Eskom's ability to maneuver, whether it is the purchasing of gas or hopefully easing up on that 18% tariff increase. I just want to, for our viewers, just indicate some of the conditions. There's 7 very stringent conditions from Treasury on this. The one is no more capex within the generation space for Eskom, which should hopefully incentivize other forms of renewable energy. But if there is any capex, it can be in transmission and distribution. If any non-core assets are sold, those proceeds may not be used for capital or operational needs. They must be used to pay down the debt relief arrangement. No new borrowing is allowed by Eskom from the 1st of April because government has taken on this contingency, and of course any new borrowing would be government guaranteed, so it'd be too much of a burden. The positive equity balances in their derivative contracts cannot be used to structure new debt. So a little bit of a patch, but definitely some serious restraint, which I think whoever the new CEO will be, however this new board moves forward, should be somewhat satisfying for most onlookers.
And I think it's fair enough from anybody's perspective. I mean, there's a quid pro quo, and understandably so. Obviously, one would have liked to have seen full debt relief, but that's impossible. We know by now the resources just don't allow it. So pretty much in accordance with what we expected. And I think any additional accommodation by government in taking over that debt would really have rendered this overall government debt situation impalatable and unsustainable.
To your point about not getting full debt relief, a number of other SOEs brought into the fold of bailouts, another billion for SAA, Post Office has now been agreed to, Sanral will still need to be faced. You know, we are on, I think, the precipice of a cabinet reshuffle. Will any of what we've seen in terms of bailouts assist in the, I suppose, the distribution of many of these SOEs to their defined departments, Transnet to transports, you know, Post Office to communications and the like?
Look, when I look at it, I mean, I don't think the reshuffle will probably have much of a bearing on the bailouts, as it were, because even if you move, let's say, SAA to transport, maybe we'll get more transparency, because the big question is we still do not know the details of this very deal. And if you're putting a billion against what? You know, and I think that's one of the biggest criticisms of the Department of Public Enterprises when it comes to the SAA deal, because in as much as the populace we do not know have the details, even Parliament, where they account, they do not have those details. So one would have expected that when the minister announces a R1 billion bailout, that at least he explains what exactly it's going towards, because the understanding was that with 50% or 51% acquisition of SA, I'm not sure of the exact percentage, that would actually bring in an element of cash injection into SAA. And at the same time, you look at the Post Office, the reality is that I don't think the boom that we see in courier services is actually a direct reflection of the failure of the Post Office. So what does this 2.4 billion do?
Quite right. So we'll find out, we'll talk a little bit more about that and other parts of, in particular, the tax revenue. Lindsay Dentlinger, our parliamentary correspondent, actually has a few more of our opposition parties standing by to give us more of their reactions to the budget speech. Lindsay?
Thanks, Refilwe. With me, I have the DA's Dr. Deon George. So we get straight into it. Dr. George, not the answer I'm sure the DA wants to the Eskom energy crisis by doling out another massive bailout that actually almost totals as much as it's given Eskom in the last 15 years.
Yes, we don't think that it's the solution. As we said earlier on this morning, is that we would be able to support a debt transfer if there was a wider plan. So if it fell part of a plan to unbundle Eskom and create a more virtuous model, for example, inject the private sector into it, independent power producers, then we would obviously be considering that. But to merely take 250 billion rand, transfer it from Eskom onto the national balance sheet, creates no incentive for Eskom to be more efficient. So we don't believe it's going to work. It's basically kicking a broken can down the road. And also what it does, if you look macroeconomically, it takes a whole stack of debt, adds it to the debt we currently have. That means that we have to pay more interest, and it will crowd out more and more service delivery. So what he's done is he thinks he's solving out the crisis at Eskom. He is not doing that. But he's also making our financial situation far less sustainable. And also, very crucially, he missed an opportunity. He's talking about being bold, but there was nothing bold in this budget. It really was a missed opportunity, because if you look at growth, of course we would support the tax rebates on solar, but we proposed 100,000 rand. He's proposing 15. It's hopelessly inadequate. Also, we would support for business to encourage them to get into renewables. We think that's a good idea, but there were no incentives, tax incentives to encourage domestic saving. There were no incentives to attract foreign capital, for example, scrapping exchange controls, nothing of that. And also additional bailouts, where he said we're going to have tough love. Well, where's the tough love? SAA is getting money, the Land Bank is getting money, and the Post Office. And the Post Office money is not for the people of the Post Office, because they're getting retrenched. It is to basically to float the state bank, which we don't support. So that was not well done. But crucially, if there's an overrun of about 90 billion rand, then the minister could have cut completely the fuel levy, could have scrapped it completely, which would immediately have made the price of petrol lower, transport lower, and then the cost of food lower. Also, he could have taken 30 billion rand of that overrun, which would be enough, and cut VAT on the additional items that we proposed. So he's left the vulnerable people in the lurch in this instance also. We do support more money for the National Prosecuting Authority, because we are likely to be grey listed on Friday, and we've got to get off that as quickly as possible, which means we need to bring financial criminals to book. But on the whole, I don't think it was bold. In fact, it was a missed opportunity.
Just quickly, before I speak to Mr. Naren Singh right behind you, I wanted to ask you about the retirement, the two-pot system. That is something that the DA has been pushing quite vociferously. We didn't get many details, though, from him, neither in the budget documents. Is it in line with what you have been calling for?
Yes. What the DA has been called for is that because people are battling so much, and yes, there's money in pensions, and you don't really want to erode that, but you do want to give people an opportunity to leverage off their own asset. So the two-pot system basically says that there will be a portion available that people can access during the course of their working life before they retire. And that will roll out in about March 2024. But that will bring very small amounts of relief, because there's actually three pots. There is the vested pot of money that's already there. Then there is the pot that will grow, and that will be available for savings. And then there will be the pot that grows that will be locked in. So it's actually three, but the savings portion that can be accessed will provide a little bit of relief. I think the big argument is going to be about taxation of that pot. Our view is that if people are going to want to access a small portion of their pension, there should be significant tax relief on that, because that's why they're taking the money. But that's an argument for the future. But yes, we are moving in the right direction. And yes, indeed, it was in fact a DA's initiative. So yes, it's one of those initiatives that we can see rolling out.
Some small wins. Thank you very much, Dr. Deon George from the DA. Refilwe, I'm going to go straight ahead to the IFP's Chief Whip, Mr. Naren Singh, right behind me. Please step up, Mr. Singh. Good afternoon to you. What are the positive takeouts? Let's start there, that you take from this afternoon's budget, if any.
Positive takeoff, no tax increases, an increase in social welfare, which is going to help the people that are relying on social grants. And I think positive that he's been quite pragmatic. But, a lot of focus and energy went on the energy crisis, and in terms of finances, and in terms of trying to deal with the energy crisis.
But is this the answer to the energy crisis, Mr. Singh? I mean, 250 billion rand over the next 3 years. Is that going to keep the lights on?
Certainly not. Certainly not. We've been saying for years now that we need to restructure Eskom. We need to relook at alternatives for energy in our country. And for some reason or other, this ANC government has been backpedaling. Whether they wanted the Friends to be part of this new energy revolution that we need in our country or not, we don't know. But Eskom has been a bottomless pit, and now they're even putting more money into SAA, putting more money into the post office, and we're going to create the post bank. Nothing that government has run, except for providing services on the ground, has been run successfully. So it's going to be a great challenge for the taxpayer that their money is being put into these bottomless pits.
A lot of money being allocated again to the fight against corruption, money for the Special Investigating Unit, the NPA and the like, but there is that very real possibility, and the Minister is trying to stay positive about the fact that South Africa could be grey-listed on Friday. How concerned is the IFP about what that might mean for the country?
Yeah, no, we're extremely concerned, and when we say a lot of money, we must look at it relatively. Is it the kind of money that is required? Is the NPA capacitated in terms of prosecution, in terms of people to lead evidence, in terms of investigators to deal with the massive corruption that we have in this country? And the answer to that is no. So one would not be surprised if there is a grey listing, because what we will have to do, and the Minister of Justice will have to do, is put a plan on the table that will show that we are going to be effective in dealing with those that have been corrupt, and also effective moving forward to stop the kind of corruption that's taking place.
Thank you very much, Mr. Naren Singh from the IFP. I think that's it for the while right now. Back to you in studio, Refilwe.
And we're back. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for giving us some of that response, both from the Democratic Alliance and the IFP, both of them touching on what we mentioned earlier on, gentlemen, regarding the Financial Action Task Force's decision that will be coming this week regarding whether or not South Africa will remain, as in the euphemistic way the Minister put it, under greater scrutiny, but really grey-listed. Your thoughts about what we heard from the Minister today?
Look, I think he's obviously preparing us. Yes. I suspect that by now, because whatever information that would be available to the authority, that's the same information that our government has, and so they know that will probably take us there. But I must say, though, I don't think grey listing, yes, it's bad for the country's image, but it may actually be the ammunition that Ramaphosa needs to further push and press the fight against corruption, right, to say that this is why we need to get back on the saddle, because we have allowed things to deteriorate over the number of years, and that is the drum that he has been banging over, in fact, throughout his presidency. Yes. So this might be his opportunity to push even further, and actually even against those within the ANC that are opposed to some of the reforms. But I must say, though, he won in December. He's got a more favorable NEC of the ANC, and if you look at the recent changes in the portfolios in terms of the subcommittees of the ANC, it's with, for lack of a better word, Ramaphosa-friendly people. So nothing stops him now. If we get grey listed, I would think that he would use this opportunity. In fact, he should use this opportunity to press his foot even further on the pedal on the fight against corruption.
Or press it at all. He has paid a great deal of lip service to the fight against corruption, but even those who have been in the NPA in the past, and quite frustratedly so, have spoken about the lack of resources. We saw an extra 1.3 billion rand being allocated there, 100 million rand specifically for the hiring of expertise and expert partnership. And to your points, one of the things that the Minister mentioned was, of those 20 shortcomings that we have, of the 40 recommendations from the FATF, these legislative changes that we saw in the General Laws Amendment of 2022 and the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorist and Related Activities Amendment Act, those address 15 of those 20, and a further 5 will be handled by regulation. Those moves are important,
yes,
but my understanding is that the FATF wants to see them having been implemented and robustly challenged.
Sure.
Is this enough?
I think it is, as a stepping stone. I think also it's perhaps easier to get off the grey list by following the right rules and regulations than it is to get out of a junk bond list.
Certainly. It took Mauritius 2 years, I believe, and it usually takes a country about 5 years coming out of...
So just takes that will and just do it, just get it done.
Right.
It's not as if there's any major psychological thing.
Certainly. Prosecutions will be very important. And just to the conversation we were having regarding rule of law, I suppose safety and legalese, The relief part of the budget towards the end of the minister's speech spoke to 650 million or so that was put to disaster relief, which I think is through climate change and other issues becoming increasingly required, and another billion in the coming year. And part of that would go to our defence force as well as recovery. We also saw some increase, I think, in police spending on police.
I think it's about 7.8 billion.
Correct, thank you very much.
5,000 boots on the streets.
Fantastic. And so all of that is quite important as well in terms of intelligence and prosecution going forward.
Yeah, every bit helps.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the tax proposals that were put forward. The Eskom relief and rebates that we mentioned a little bit earlier before we went over to Lindsay, between business and individuals accounts for about a 13 billion rand relief for taxpayers. But a couple of other bits of good news. No change to the fuel levy or RAF. No increase in VAT, which is often touted as a source of funding. As you mentioned, with the extension of the social relief of distress grant for those at lower income or no income levels up until March next year. And otherwise, I imagine that there will be some kind of moderations allowed in our brackets for bracket.
Yes, definitely, absolutely.
Which constitutes relief in itself.
It does constitute relief, and in fact, it's interesting that by not adjusting the fuel levy, they're losing out on the potential 4 billion rand.
All right.
But overall, in net terms, tax relief of some 13 billion.
Yes.
Which is not a fortune, but it's certainly much better than minus 13.
Certainly.
And in the circumstances, probably quite surprising. As you mentioned, we didn't see the increase in the fuel levy. Well done on that one. The typical sin tax is going up.
Yes.
Not surprising. Corporate income tax, kind of as we were thinking a bit earlier, he decided not to continue for the time being with the gradual decline, obviously postponing that for the time being. But at least it didn't go up.
Correct.
So I think as taxpayers, we got off fairly lightly.
We certainly did in a difficult environment.
Yes.
It makes for, I imagine, Spoor, an easier entry into an election year. As you said, opposition not that frustrated. You know, the DA had a lot of adjustments at the edges.
Sure.
Certainly, I think that's one of the things that he had to be mindful of, and just to make sure that whatever spending we do or whatever this budget entails, it must come across as being, as the ANC had said, it must be seen to be poor friendly. I'm not quite sure if it goes the full stretch. I was very much keen to hear COSATU, but hopefully we'll still hear their response. But I must say though, I mean, there are a little bit of concessions and also a leeway that households and individual taxpayers will be some relief that they are getting out of this. So I think in a way it does try to tick all of those boxes.
It does. All right, so some relief for us in a very tough environment, inflation at 6.9% towards the end of 2022. So it is a relief to know that we won't be paying more in taxes. Hopefully increases in electricity tariffs will be tempered by this bailout, and hopefully we are able to constrain a great deal of our spending on interest repayments, particularly if grey listing does, as Wu indicates, lead to firmer control on corruption from the presidency and the NPA. Professor, you seem to have one last thought you'd like to give us.
Another bit of positive news is that their assumptions are looking at inflation declining over the next 3 years to 5.3% this year and 4.7 by 25, which would imply a decline in interest rates.
Certainly.
Don't expect them tomorrow, but towards the end of this year, possibly interest rates start coming up, which would also provide some important relief to households.
I would say the cutting cycle only starts in 2024. We probably have a hold into the end of the year on basic.
I think not before the end of the year, but maybe by the fourth quarter, possibly. But certainly not before then.
This prediction lives forever online, and we will return to it.
And it's going to be wrong, so take the opposite and then...
You are a contrarian indicator. Professor Andre Roux, thank you so much. Economist and futurist from Stellenbosch University Business School, who joins us today to give the economic perspective, and as ever giving the insight both from economics and political sides. Swu Ngalwa, the editor-in-chief of Eyewitness News. I'm Refilwe Moloto, your anchor for today. Thank you to Lindsay Dentlinger and the entire EWN team for today's live broadcast. Do check us out if you've missed any part of this on all of our social handles or on our YouTube EWN page. And we'll see you at the next budget.